Our next story is read by the super talented Sarah Leigh.
Only the River Knows by Sue Fitton. Turning the corner, Tanya was relieved to be at a long journey's end. The familiar driveway stretched out in front of her, winding its way like a ribbon wafting in the breeze. A welcome yet unfamiliar sense of calm greeted her as she pulled up at the front door, framed with roses, their sweet aroma confirming she was home. "Ah, there you are, my dear." A pink-faced and slightly wheezy Mrs. McKee appeared. "Just drop the milk and tea bags in. Sorry I can't be round to give a hand. Mr. M took bad again," she sighed. "Thanks, Mrs. M. I'm sure I can cope. Your husband needs you more than me. The estate agent is coming tomorrow and I'm here till Friday." So sad to think it's come to this. Everything is just as he left it. We all miss him down the pub. Your father could entertain us all for hours with his fantastical tales. Chuckling, she waved and waddled back down the drive. Waiting for the familiar whistling of the kettle on the stove, the enormity of what she was here to do threatened to crush her resolve. She had a plan and she had to get on with it. But wandering through the small cottage, the cosy, cluttered rooms brought back so many fond memories. A thin layer of dust covered everything, like a thin gossamer gown, the sun's rays illuminating the particles floating in the air. Opening the windows to let in a light summer breeze, it was as if the cottage took a breath. Propped up in the recess by the fireplace was the old fishing rod, a few jam jars with their string handles and his favourite brolly. Dotted around were photos in their dusty frames, mostly of her through the years with Dad, and a few precious ones of Mum with her as a baby. Upstairs, she was delighted to see her old pink blanket still spread out on the bed in her little room. Fresh lavender and rose petals were scattered on her pillow. "That was thoughtful of you, Mrs. McKee," she said out loud to the old threadbare teddy sitting on the shelf. The next few days were spent trying to fill black bags with her father's belongings and finding herself reminiscing about each item as she held it. A little book filled with dried flowers. He'd been so meticulous about preserving the beauty of the petals. At the same time, she had to contend with being constantly disturbed to answering queries from the office. She wondered how she had gotten herself onto such a merry-go-round. She had flown the nest with her father's blessing. Had he not supported her through university and her decision to move to the city? She had worked hard at her job, and yes, it was high octane, but she was good at it. The latest boyfriend had been shelved, and she did regret that a little, but there would be another soon enough. There usually was. The seeds of doubt began to grow in her mind. She knew it would be hard disposing of her childhood memories. However, it had to be done. She had made a plan. With Friday looming and the thought of another hot and unpleasant journey back to the crowded metropolis, she decided that a walk in the woods for old time's sake was what she owed herself and Dad too. Descending the hill towards the woods, her spirits lifted. The path into the woods opened in front of her, coaxing her along a once familiar route. Or was it? She felt momentarily confused. She didn't remember the little path to the left. Well, why not? She could hear the river gurgling on its way below, so she knew she was in the right direction. The path widened and a little clearing spread out in front of her. Twinkling gold lights danced across the waterway. Trout meandered through the forest of the riverbed, occasionally surfacing, causing the ripples to spread out and lap along the boulders, spread throughout the river. Gazing at the beauty around her and settling herself on the grass, the tears were bound to fall. She knew in her heart how much her father loved this place. And for the first time since his death, she finally allowed herself to grieve. She'd been so far away and just too absorbed in her work to come back sooner. "Don't be sad." Startled, she looked around, expecting to see Dad, but of course there was nobody there. She spied a dragonfly from the corner of her eye. At least she thought it was a dragonfly. "Who's there?" she said, whilst at the same time knowing how ridiculous it was talking to herself. "He said you would remember." "Of course I'm imagining it, I'm just missing him," she reasoned to herself. "Perhaps I do need a break more than I thought." From her backpack, she carefully lifted out the casket. "I thought this would be the best place for you, Dad." she said quietly as she clutched it to her chest. I know you loved it here as I did too when I was little. She had been a child alone, but not lonely. She had her imaginary friends. They had comforted her when Mum died. They told her stories and were her companions. But she had grown up. Her little friends had gone, and somehow the connection with nature she once had gone too. As the tears subsided, she noticed the little red door at the base of the old oak tree, now faded and rotting away. It was the fairy door her father had made for her all those years ago. She remembered him telling her tales of the fairy realm beyond. They needed a door to come and go, he had said, and she had believed him back then. A fantastical world for a small child to retreat to at a troubled time. Her father taught her everything there was to know about the trees, the seasons, and the river. They were innocent, happy days. A trout leapt out of the water at that moment, waking her from her revelry, catching a fly on its way back down. The resulting ripples twinkling more brightly in the sun. A streak of iridescent blue and gold whizzed past her ear. Why don't dragonflies slow down? She thought. Well, it has to be done, she said to herself as she gathered her things and packed away everything away except the casket. Taking her boots off, she stood and walked into the river, the gravel underfoot causing her to step gingerly, but the chill of the water invigorating her. About halfway in, she stopped to check the direction of the breeze, then opened the casket. Holding it tight, she flung her arms up and watched as the particles hung, suspended for a moment in the air and then drifted away. And as she watched, she had a sudden need to shout at the top of her voice, "This is for you, Dad. And yes, I do believe in fairies." A sunburst hit her eyes, momentarily blinding her. She turned and found herself laughing uncontrollably. "Be at peace, Dad. I love you." She carefully put the now empty casket into her backpack, put on her boots and turned for home. 20 minutes later, she was walking back along the little track and onto the well-trodden path. Beginning the ascent back to the cottage, her thoughts returned to the dismal task of sorting out her parents' belongings and selling the house. Perhaps she could stay another week. They could manage in the office, couldn't they? "I'll remember to believe, Dad," Tanya said, smiling to herself as she wondered she should write down some of those stories. He was known locally as the storyteller, after all. Back at the cottage, sitting curled in the old armchair with a handful of rose petals, she knew she had really come home and giggled.